One of the new Edmonton Oilers, Vasily Podkolzin, presents an interesting opportunity for the team's bottom six. What does he bring to the table? What's he done in the past? And what do the Oilers see in him?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So on today's episode, we're going to take a dive into Vasily Podkolzin. And you may be asking me, Nick, why are you going to spend an entire episode talking about a guy who may or may not even make the team out of training camp and may or may not just be a warm body? And part of the reason, and we talked about this a lot last week, after the dust of the offer sheets has settled, we do have to talk about the fact that the Oilers don't really have a variety of outcomes. You know, a lot of the guys on this team are pretty established, have long NHL track records, and kind of fall into somewhere around what they've always been, where someone like Podkolzin, who will be the youngest forward on the roster, unless Savoie makes the team or if he doesn't make the team, whatever. But when you have those young guys who maybe need a little opportunity, who need some run, and you can give them an opportunity, that's where there's an opportunity for teams, even teams that are up against the cap, like the Oilers, to take creative risks to improve their team. So first segment, we're going to talk all about his background, his draft status, where he's been developing, how his usage has evolved, how his career has kind of taken shape. The second segment, we're going to talk about the counting stats, the production, what those numbers tell you about his game. And then our final segment, we're going to talk about a little bit about how that might fit in with what the Oilers want to do. So at the outset, and this is not breaking news, I've talked about this a lot with a variety of players over the last handful of years. You need to understand that any player drafted between 2018 and still probably till right now in 2024, those players have had their development cycles fundamentally altered to an irrevocable level by the pandemic. I know we're pretty far removed from 2020, 2021, where junior seasons and college seasons and international seasons abroad and men's leagues over in Sweden and Russia, etc., were canceled or abridged or modified. But I don't think people understand how important those development years are to a player. When you get drafted at 17, 18, or 19, that first year or two after you get drafted by an NHL franchise, those are probably the most pivotal 2 seasons of your development cycle, because that's when you start conferring with professionals. You get on an NHL strength training program. You get on an NHL nutrition program. You have developmental people in an organization checking in on you every few weeks to talk about your game. And all of that stopped for a while. There are a lot of players who played their season up through March of 2020, and then no season. They are put on hold through the fall of that year. And some leagues abroad were able to come back by the fall or the early part of the following year. The NHL, of course, came back January of that following year. But when you lose a year and a half of your development cycle at the most crucial points in your career, I do think it's fair to start grading and considering these players and their trajectories on a curve. Brings us to Podkolzin. A lot of guys, when you go look at that 2019 draft class, have really had uneven or outright disappointing starts to their NHL careers. And I think it's fair to put a chunk of that blame on the pandemic. When you look at a guy like Podkolzin, drafted 10th overall, playing on a pretty good KHL team, you would think, okay, we're going to draft this guy summer 2019, June 2019. And then he's going to stay in Russia for a few years. That's generally how it works. They do their D+1, D+2 over in Russia. Then they come over at 21 or 22, and then they start getting the ground running on their NHL career. For Podkolzin, you go and look at the games played. It is not the same type of rigor in Podkolzin's development cycle as it is if you were in the NHL or if you were over here in America. So he's drafted in the summer of 2019. He goes back to play for SKA in the junior KHL. He plays for St. Petersburg for 2019, 2020, and then 2020, 2021. Then he comes over, first full season in the NHL as a 21-year-old, 79 games played as a rookie on a bad Canucks team. You know, I do think it is important to note that the best counting stat season and the most opportunity Podkolzin has ever gotten in the NHL. And, you know, he only has 3 seasons over here in North America, so you can say that's not a big sample, but the most run he ever got was his rookie season, where the Canucks got off to that abysmal start under Travis Green. They bring in Bruce Boudreau. They get on a nice second half run, and that really kind of, when you're on a bad team and you're a young player, you're going to get more opportunities because the team isn't as worried about the wins and losses because they understand the limitations. That rookie season, the most common line mates he was deployed with were Connor Garland and Elias Pettersson. And Elias Pettersson is a top 20 player in the entire NHL, and Connor Garland is one of the most underrated players in the entire NHL. We as Oiler fans do recall how effective he was in that playoff series in the second round, Connor Garland, where even though as an undersized guy, he's able to battle for those high danger areas of the ice, get to the net front, and then win those position battles. And when you're a guy like Podkolzin, who's coming over as a first round pick, you have considerable runway where we're playing you with Pettersson, we're playing you with Connor Garland. We want to see what you can do. We know the team isn't that good, so you're going to have real opportunities here. And there were flashes of promise. You know, I can recall watching the Canucks that season, because as a true hockey sicko, if hockey's on, I'm going to watch it, and thinking, he's got a little something here. If you go watch the highlight tape from Podkolzin's rookie season, there are flashes of a skilled player. He hit some really nice shots, some upper echelon shooter shots. You can't take one season as the bellwether of a player, but coming off of that first season 2 years ago, well, now three hockey seasons ago, 2 calendar years ago, I felt like Podkolzin was probably a middle six forward. I felt that with those puck skills, even if he couldn't force his way on to a first or a second line, he could still be a 40-point player, reasonable defensive skills. And if you're not a great team, he could probably be on your second line and it wouldn't be the end of the world. But it changed. You know, the tenor of the Canucks changed, where Boudreau takes over, they go on the nice run down the backstretch, then they come into the following season, and it doesn't go well. You know, Boudreau gets fired, they bring in Rick Tocchet, and the Canucks continue to add pieces on. And Podkolzin, drafted by a different regime as well, different general manager. So when you have a new general manager, a new coaching staff who aren't as invested in a player, even one as talented as a first-round pick as Podkolzin was as a developmental player, you're left to wonder what the opportunities are. And when you don't have opportunities, something like this, getting traded to a good team like the Oilers, it's a twofold proposition. And guys who are drafted in the first round, especially drafted highly in the first round, they will continue to get chances. Even if it doesn't really work out for Podkolzin in Edmonton, another team will give him a chance. And when you look at the profile, he doesn't have a lot of, he does not have a big track record. He has 137 career NHL games as a 23-year-old. He's really hasn't played close to a full season and 2 NHL seasons. His rookie season, he played 79 games 2 years ago, 30-something, and this past season, 19. He fell out of favor with the regime in Vancouver, who had other guys they liked. They spent some money on free agents. They traded for other guys, and they tried to build out their roster in a certain way, and this presents a real opportunity. And coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about Podkolzin's game as an individual, how it might fit in with the Oilers on this edition of Locked On Oilers, so be sure to stick around. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you now. Through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment you can cancel anytime. You've heard me talking about it for a few weeks now. The NFL season, hot out of the gate. Lamar Jackson, reigning NFL MVP and the Ravens going to Arrowhead to play the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs 3-point favorites in Arrowhead. That first week of the season, we got Friday Night Football too. The Packers taking on the Eagles down in Brazil. The Eagles are 2.5-point favorites as the home team in Brazil. And then the game I'm most excited for week 1, the returning Anthony Richardson and the Indianapolis Colts hosting the Houston Texans, and CJ Stroud coming off of one of the best rookie quarterback seasons of recent memory. The Texans right now 1.5-point favorites on the road at the Colts in week 1. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook and get in on the action. Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So when we're evaluating players who don't have big sample sizes, the best we can do is trying to discern their individual skills. It's when a guy doesn't have a lot of NHL games, it can be tricky to evaluate what type of player they are, especially if we're only dealing with our traditional counting stats. If we're only looking at goals and assists, those are very heavily correlated to time on ice, special teams usage, and line mates. You can be a really good NHL player and only record 20, 25 points because you're not on a power play. You're playing 13, 14 minutes a night. You're not playing with great line mates. And that's where we can start to distill out. So looking at Podkolzin's counting stats, it's nothing special. These are very ugly stats. So his rookie season, he has 110 shots on goal, 14 goals, 12 assists. He scores on 12% of his shots. He does that with line mates who shoot for a combined 8.42%, and the on-ice save percentage that season is .934. Very good underlying numbers. As we said before, he's playing a lot with Elias Pettersson, with Connor Garland. Those are good numbers. Then, 2 NHL seasons ago, 40 shots on goal, 4 goals, 3 assists, 9.8 on-ice shooting percentage. 9.8 shooting percentage, 6.16 on-ice shooting percentage, 9.26 save percentage. Then, this past NHL season, 18 shots on goal, 0 goals, 2 assists, 0 shooting percentage, obviously, because he didn't score a goal. The line mates combined 5.75, and then goalie 902 saves. So that tells me a few things. Number one, it tells me Podkolzin's role with the Canucks changed over the 3 years he was with the team. He went from playing with upper echelon, top 6 talent, as I said before, Pettersson, one of the 15, 20 best players in the entire NHL, depending how you feel about certain guys, and Connor Garland, who's a really toolsy, useful, functional top 9 NHL forward, where if he's on your first line, you're probably not great, but you can get by. If he's on your third line, you're a pretty deep team. Last year on the Canucks, Connor Garland was a third liner on what was a very well-rounded Canucks forward group. So Podkolzin's role changes. The coaching staff changes twice in his 3 years on the team. And I think it's fair to say the Canucks, the people in charge, the decision makers, they did not see what the previous regime had seen in Podkolzin's game. So they weren't as concerned about getting him ice time, about playing him with high-end players. And how players deal with setbacks in their development cycle, in their professional careers, it reflects a lot about them. And there is a stigma associated with European and Russian players that unfairly gets tossed on them, that they're not good defensively, that they're lazy, that they need to learn how to play a 200-foot North American game because the rink is smaller, there's less space, they're less inclined to play have a physical component to their game. And I've never found that to be the case. I have found that to be very disparaging and just frankly unfair to chalk guys up to where they come from as being why they play a certain way. And look, it's not dumb to say different leagues have different styles. You know, we see that in the CHL, you know, the Q versus the W versus the O. The major Canadian junior leagues all have different playing styles. That makes sense. NHL and the AHL have different playing styles. But saying just because somebody plays from Russia or Sweden they're less physical. That's not fair. You need to judge each player individually on their skill sets. And the thing that is encouraging about Podkolzin's game, at least in the last year or so, is that the defensive impacts are decent. He is a reasonably gifted forechecker. He's not a great skater. He's a passable skater for today's game. He's got a little bit of size. And for the Oilers, and you heard me talk about this a lot during the Cup final and in the aftermath of the Cup final, the Oilers needed more diversity of skill set. And I'm not saying Podkolzin's going to come over and be Joel Eriksson Ek. He's not going to be Sasha Barkov. He's not going to be Nico Hischier. But you add a guy who is good off the cycle, who can forecheck, who can win puck retrievals on dump-ins. That adds a component to the Oilers that they really didn't have last year. And you can be a great offensive team like the Oilers were last season, but when you are constantly up and down, rush chance after rush chance, that tires your guys out. It puts more stress on your defense. You have heard me say it a lot. I'll repeat it again right now. Rush scoring chances, you only typically get one. You gain the zone with speed, you're going to get a decent look because you're putting pressure on the defense and the goalie. But because of that rush situation, you're going to get your shot, and you're probably not going to be able to win that loose puck again. When you can't win that loose puck, the other team's going to recover, and they're going to go back the other way, because if you were just coming off of the rush, that probably means you're not as in structure as you should be. It allows the opponent to get back going the other way. And when you're in a situation where you can trade chances back and forth, and the Oilers are pretty good at that because of their high-end talent, you can live with that. But in a game, in a series that's a little bit slower, that's a little bit more earn your ice, earn your space, work for your space, like the Cup final was against Florida, the Oilers' lack of a forecheck, lack of a sustained cycle, it started to bleed into the rest of the way they played. It made their defense more tired. It made their defense play more defense. And in today's NHL, you don't want to play that much defense. And number two, the Oilers have physically talented players on that back end. You've heard me wax poetic about Ekholm and Bouchard. But once you get past that first pair, you don't want Nurse. You didn't want Ceci. You didn't want Kulak. You didn't want those guys having to play more defense than they needed to, because the risk of mistake was greater. And you add a Podkolzin to that bottom six, and you have him with Connor Brown and Corey Perry and Adam Henrique. The opportunity for a more diverse set of lines helps. When you have a third or a fourth line that can really work the cycle, that bleeds the other team out, forces them to play defense, that's going to have two effects. Number one, you're eventually going to start to wear their defense down. And then number two, your defense is going to be better because it's playing less defense. When you are working that cycle, you are playing the perimeter, you are working to the middle for a quality scoring chance, you are going to set yourself up to really, really succeed, because the less defense you play, the better in today's game. When you are playing the best of the best, you don't even want them to have the puck, because it does not take a lot for them to be able to convert those scoring chances. We're going to take one more quick break. We're going to talk a bit about how Podkolzin might fit in with the Oilers right now, if he has more upside to his game, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers in the dog days of summer. We are inching closer and closer to the start of the NHL season. We're about 2.5, 3 weeks away from preseason testing, training camp, and eventually we're probably about 3 weeks away from preseason. So we're going to start to ramp up the content. It's going to start being a little bit more forward-looking towards this upcoming season. We'll start doing previews. We'll start doing projections. We'll get some guests in the mix to give you some varying perspectives as opposed to just me, who's doing the research nerd thing, coming at you with a lot of information. I always like to do it, as much information as I can give you to let you know, because at the end of the day, the Oilers are asking you for your time, your money, and your feelings. They want you to care. And if you didn't care, you wouldn't be listening to a podcast on your free time. You wouldn't be willing to spend one of the highest average ticket prices in the entire NHL. And if you're going to have that level of commitment, you got to know what's going on. You want to be as informed as you can be. So when you drop that $160 to go to a game against the Senators in December, you feel good about that. So Podkolzin, as a 23-year-old, presents room. And look, this entire episode very well could be moot. Podkolzin might not even make the team. I'm under the opinion that Joshua Brown is going to be the waiver cut, the DFA, whatever phraseology you want to use to describe it. The Oilers are going to have to get rid of one of the people that are currently on the 19, 20-man roster for this upcoming season. And it feels more likely that it's a forward who goes down as opposed to a defenseman, just simply because of how uncertain that back end is. But with Stetcher and Emberson relatively penciled in to the right side behind Evan Bouchard, that bottom six leaves you with Janmark, Henrique, Connor Brown, Podkolzin, Derek Ryan, Corey Perry, and then we don't know what Evander Kane's situation is going to be. If Podkolzin is playing on a fourth line with Corey Perry and with Derek Ryan, that fourth line's job is going to be cycle the puck into oblivion. It is not going to be to score goals. It is not going to be to create dangerous offense. That group's goal is going to be get the puck deep, force the other team to at least try and recover the loose puck, and then contain the breakout and wear down the other team. And Podkolzin, I think it's not a crazy take to say that at this point where we sit in 2024, Podkolzin's more physically talented than Corey Perry and Derek Ryan. He has enough skill and he has enough opportunity that I don't think he's going for 15, 20 goals. I think Podkolzin can sniff 9 or 10 goals playing on that fourth line. And I've always had this in the back of my mind. If you have at least one guy on your fourth line who can flirt with 10 goals, you got a pretty deep lineup. Corey Perry had 9 in the few months he was on the Oilers. I think Podkolzin can be around that number. If Podkolzin can give you 8 or 9 goals, he can be defensively responsible, he can work the cycle, that helps. And when you're going to have Stetcher and Emberson back in your top 6, Emberson who has 30 games of NHL experience, and Troy Stetcher, who hasn't been a full-time NHLer in a handful of seasons now, that tells me you're going to need your forwards to help more. And I talked about it a ton during the final. Florida's defensemen individually are not great. Other than Gus Forsling, none of those guys is an elite all-around player. And Forsling is more defensive impact than offensive, but he's got enough puck skill where he can hold his own. But you talk about Ekblad, Montour, Mikkola, Ekman-Larsson, Kulikov. None of those guys is incredible, but they're all good at what they're good at. And their partner was talented in a way they weren't, so they complemented each other. And the Oilers are going to need a more cohesive team commitment to defense with this uncertainty on the back end. And Podkolzin, as I said before, he's not an elite defensive forward. He's never going to be a Selke guy. He's above average defensively. That's better than Derek Ryan. That's better than Corey Perry. If they can be out there and not just be head barely above water, that was me. If you're watching on YouTube, I was tilting my head back to give the illusion to somebody who's borderline drowning. And that's the illusion, that's the visual representation I like to think about for a fourth line. Is the fourth line able to maintain offensive zone time? And I forgot to cite this stat, so I want to get it in now. Last year, in the limited ice time that Podkolzin had on the Canucks playing 19 regular season games, he was 90th percentile in offensive zone time. And the Canucks were a pretty strong possession team for the first half of the season, and as the season went along, they kind of found a different way to win. They were scoring more on lower percentage chances. They didn't necessarily need to win the possession battle to win the game. Podkolzin brings that to your fourth line. Suddenly we're going to have more opportunities. And that, I think, is the key for me in this evaluation. And we're going to do Ty Emberson at some point this week. It might be tomorrow. It might be Wednesday. I'm not sure yet. But You need these types of players who need an opportunity to kind of prove themselves. And this is where you can stumble into a diamond in the rough. When you find a player who just needs ice time, who just needs an opportunity, who's going to be grateful for a chance, and on a good team, if he hammers his role, he can be really valuable. You think about what Connor Brown was in the playoffs. You think about what Matthias Janmark was in the playoffs, especially the further they went along. That's where your depth sets itself apart. The longer you go in the playoffs, the better your opposition, the deeper your opposition's lineup is going to be. And that's going to put you in a position where you need that occasional fourth line or penalty kill goal to be the difference in a 1-goal game. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. Do you think Podkolzin is going to stick as a fourth liner this year? Do you think he's going to be a waiver, a guy the Oilers lose on waivers? Let me know what you think. And before we get out of here, 3 things. Number 1, shout out the American Dragon, Brian Danielson. That was awesome. Shout out Oasis, getting back together. Real music is back. And then number 3, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen to the day. Now, go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local flavor. And find the link to Locked On NHL in the description so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. See you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.